is going to introduce you to the wonderful world of bonds. My name is Cynthia Bush, and I am your Finance-ista. So first, what is a bond? Well, a bond is nothing more than a loan. And normally we have used the term when we're talking about a long-term loan. If we're talking about corporate bonds, we normally mean longer than 5 years. So a corporate bond is something that's issued by a corporation when it wants to borrow money. We also have government bonds, and that just means it is a government who wants to borrow money. But for the rest of this video, I'm primarily going to focus on the corporate bond world. So let's talk terminology for a second. If a company is borrowing money for 5 years or longer, we say that this company is issuing a bond. Think of it as a situation where companies pre-computer used to create pieces of paper like what you just saw with that bond certificate in the prior slide. And on that piece of paper, it would have the company's name and logo. It would have what type of bond it is, when it matures, how much they're borrowing, and the rate. And what the company would do is if they could find someone to lend them the money, they would hand that piece of paper to the lender, and in return, the lender would hand the company the money that it's loaning to them. And that piece of paper would indicate legally that the lender had lent this money to the company and that the company was legally bound to pay it back under the terms so specified. So when a company is borrowing money, we say they are issuing a bond if they're doing it with a bond. And if an investor is lending the company money for a long time in corporate bond world, 5 years or more, we say the investor is buying a bond or the investor is investing in a bond. Now, there are many different types of bonds. Let's first talk about secured bonds. Secured bonds are just what they sound like. They are loans that are secured by a certain asset. If any of you have borrowed money to buy a vehicle, you have issued a secured bond. And if you think about it, when you borrow money to buy a vehicle, you have to sign a lot of paperwork. These days, a lot of that paperwork is now digitized, but you still have to put a signature on there. The paperwork says you're borrowing the money from such and such institution. You agree to make monthly payments in a certain amount by a certain date each month, and the loan is going to be outstanding until such and such a time period, like the maturity. And it also will say the implicit interest rate on the loan is, and it will give a percentage. So all of that is in the paperwork that you sign when you buy a vehicle. Additionally, you also sign something that says, if you fail to fulfill the promises to repay the money monthly, in full, and on time, after a certain time period, the entity who is lending you the money to buy the car has the legal right to go take the car. So that bond that you have issued when you borrow money to buy a car is a bond that is secured by the vehicle that you are purchasing. And so we call it a secured bond or a secured auto bond. And the lenders like secured bonds, right? Because they're running a risk in lending you the money. But the way they can mitigate some of the risk is they can say, well, worst case scenario, if this borrower doesn't repay me, I should be able to go and get the car, take it back, hopefully resell it, repay myself the money that I'm owed, and perhaps have some left over to cover my expenses and maybe even make a profit on the deal. So again, if you borrowed money to buy a car, you issued a secured bond, and was specifically an auto bond. Now, here's another scenario. If you borrowed money to buy a house, you've also issued a bond. It's called a mortgage bond. The word mortgage is the word we use to specifically denote that the loan is being used to purchase real estate. So if you issue a mortgage bond, that simply means you have borrowed money to buy a piece of property. Now, keep in mind that paperwork that you're signing when you borrow money under a mortgage bond is very detailed, very voluminous. And in addition to saying the name of the property, your name as the borrower, the time period, the payment structure, typically monthly, the interest rate, and the maturity date, all of that paperwork, somewhere in there, it also says if you fail to make your monthly payments in full and on time, after a certain time period of you being delinquent, the lender under this mortgage bond has the legal right to take your house. Now, of course, unlike a car loan, the lender can't repossess your house, right? They can't pick up the house and physically move it. That's pretty challenging. So typically what a lender will do is they will change the locks on the house and kick the homeowners out. And the lender really doesn't want your house, just like they don't want the car. What they really want is to get their money back. So they're going to take the house, hopefully spruce it up a little bit if they need to, put it back on the market, try to sell it to repay themselves for the home loan that they lent to you. And if there is more money that they get from selling the house than what you owe them, they get to keep it. Okay. So if you borrowed money to buy a house, you issued a mortgage bond, and the company lending you the money to buy the house has purchased a mortgage bond. So those are two types of bonds right there. Technically, a mortgage bond is considered a secured bond, but we kind of delineate it a little bit separately. Then we have something called a debenture. A debenture is an unsecured bond. So that means that the person who is lending the corporation or lending you money under a debenture does not have the legal right to take a specific asset if you fail to repay them in full and on time, as specified by the debenture contract. An example of a debenture, which is just a long-term unsecured loan, is if you were to borrow money to go to college. So if you have a student loan, you have issued a debenture, right? Under the terms of that student loan, the lenders do not have the right to come and take your car if you don't repay the student loan, nor do they have the legal right to come and take your house, right? So if you don't repay under that student loan, the lender is unsecured, they now have to take you to court and try to fight for the right to get control of some of your assets that they can use to repay themselves. So a debenture is considered riskier than a secured bond because it's more difficult for the lender to repay themselves in the event of a default, meaning whoever borrowed the money under the bond is not repaying. An unsubordinated bond, it just refers to the order of repayment if there's a default. So if a corporation or an individual does not make payments in full on time per the contract they signed when they borrowed the money under the bond indenture, the very first people to get repaid are going to be your secured bondholders. They're going to take the assets they're legally allowed to take and sell them to repay themselves. The next people who are up are your debenture holders, your unsecured debt holders. They are going to petition the courts for any assets that may be left that they can take and hopefully sell to repay themselves whatever they are owed. So those are the unsubordinated bonds. After that, you have subordinated bonds. Subordinated just means that they fall in line after these groups further up on this page. So subordinated bondholders are only repaid after everybody else on the page has been paid, which basically means subordinated bondholders take a greater risk than secured bondholders. They do not have a particular asset they can go after, and they have to wait in line if you default or the company defaults until they can try to go after some assets and get repaid. We also have zero coupon bonds, and I'm not going to talk about them in this video, but know that they don't have explicit interest payments, but they do still play an implicit interest. If you're interested in learning more about zero coupon bonds, see my video on zero coupon bonds. And now we have an example. So let's pretend we have AVIS, who issued a $1,000 8% annual coupon bond due in 2026. That bond is a 5-year bond if we assume that this is 2021. So if I look at this timeline, which is delineated by years, notice that this is a 5-year timeline. If I am AVIS, the company, I am going to receive $1,000 today, right? Because a bond means that if AVIS has issued a bond, AVIS is borrowing money. So in this example, they're borrowing $1,000 today. AVIS borrows the money today, and they agree to make coupon payments. These coupon payments are that 8%. And the way we calculate the dollar amount of the coupon payment is we take 8% times the $1,000 that AVIS agrees to pay the lender when this bond matures in 2026. So notice at the end of the timeline, AVIS is repaying or paying the lender $1,000. So, but in between, from the time AVIS receives the money in time zero of $1,000 and the time that they pay the lender $1,000 5 years from now when the bond matures, and we're assuming it's going to be 2026, AVIS has also agreed to make what we call annual coupon payments. So this $80 is derived by taking 8% and multiplying it by this $1,000 that AVIS agrees to repay at the end of 5 years. So 8% times 1,000 is $80. So AVIS will receive $1,000 today. They will pay $80 a year for 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, AVIS will also pay $1,000 to the lender or lenders. So this is what the cash flows look like under a typical corporate bond. Now, let's make sure everybody is clear on terminology. So present value is the amount that the company is borrowing today. It's also what the bond is worth today, okay? So that's also the amount that the investor is lending to the company or to the individual. That's the present value. The coupon percent is only used to determine the amount of the periodic payments that the company is going to make to the investor, meaning the borrower is making to the lender. So that's the $80. These are the coupon payments. The face value, also known as par value, is the amount that the borrower is going to pay to the lender at maturity of the bond. This is in addition to the coupon payments. Whatever that last coupon payment is, this is in addition to that. And in corporate bond world, corporate bonds are issued in $1,000 increments. So if someone wants to borrow $10,000, they will issue 10 $1,000 bonds, $1,000 denominated bonds. Each bond is considered to have a face value, also known as the par value of $1,000. And then the interest rate is the rate that the borrower is paying to borrow the money under this bond. It's also the rate that the lender is paying to lend the money under the bond. All right, so I want you to really recognize that when we're talking about the cash flows of a bond, this is simply time value of money. And we can split it into two different time value of money problems. For those of you who are not familiar with time value of money, feel free to see my video on time value of money. Now, the first thing to notice is the coupons. AVIS is agreeing to pay coupons of $80 a year for 5 years. I made them negative to show that is coming out of AVIS's account, going to the lender, okay? This stream of payments is considered an annuity. And if you're not familiar with annuities, feel free to watch my video on annuities, okay? But this is an annuity stream. We can find the present value of this annuity, the present value of these coupon payments. So if you're using a financial calculator, think about your variables. N is the time period. It's 5 years. I is the interest rate. In this example, I'm going to use 8%. The payment is the coupon payment that the company is making to the people it borrowed money from under this bond. Future value here is irrelevant because we're looking for the present value of the coupon payments. And so then we solve for present value and you get $319.42. Now I have multiplied my N by 1 and divided my I by 1 because these are annual payments, one time a year. So if you remember your present value, remember if the payments happen more than once a year, we need to make an adjustment. And the adjustment is always you multiply N by the number of times the payment is made per year, and you divide the I by the number of times the payment's made per year. And in bond world, we also divide the actual payment. But in this case, since the payment is just made once a year for 5 years, I multiply my N by 1, divide my I by 1, and divide my payment by 1. All right, so that takes care of this annuity stream that AVIS is paying to the lenders of $80 a year for 5 years. So we now found the present value of that. Now we can find the present value of the $1,000 that AVIS is paying to the lender when these bonds mature in 2026, which we're assuming is 5 years from now. Notice we're going to find the present value of just this $1,000, not the present value of the $1,080 that the company is actually paying to the lender, because this $80, we already found the present value of this, and we found the present value of this annuity stream. So we're just going to focus on the $1,000 for this part. And to find the present value of the $1,000 face value, it's the same process. We take the N is 5 years. We're assuming this bond matures in 5 years in 2026. The I is the interest rate, which right now I'm going to assume is 8%. The future value is simply the face value of $1,000. And remember, I said corporate bonds are issued in $1,000 increments. There is no payment here, so payment is irrelevant. Okay, so PMT would be 0. You plug all that into your financial calculator, you solve for present value, and you get $680.58. You could also use the equation, which is present value equals future value divided by 1 plus I to the N. So both will work, the equation or your financial calculator. So when you look at the AVIS bond, the lenders lent AVIS $1,000 today. They got to that assuming an 8% interest because the present value of those $80 coupon payments was $319.42. So that's the present value of an annuity. And then they did the present value of the par amount of $1,000 that's going to be received by the lender in 5 years. And when you present value that back, that's worth $680.58 in today's money. So when you add the two together, the present value of the coupon payments plus the present value of the face value of the bond at maturity, you get the value of the bond today. So this is how much money the lender should loan the company today under this bond. Now, let me show you this from Hertz's viewpoint, and then I'm going to show you a wrinkle. So Hertz issued a $1,000 15% annual coupon bond due in 2026. I am going to assume that we are standing in 2021, so 2026 is 5 years from now. So first, Hertz is going to receive $1,000 today. So they are borrowing money. Since it says they issued a bond, that means they borrowed money. So Hertz has borrowed money. They've borrowed $1,000 today. The coupon is 15% payable annually. So to calculate how much that is in dollars, take 15% times the face value that Hertz is going to pay the lender at the end of 5 years when the bond matures. So 15% times $1,000 is $150. So Hertz is agreeing, I'm going to borrow $1,000 today. I'm going to repay $150 a year for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, I am also going to pay the lender $1,000. That's the arrangement. Okay. Now, the way bond investors make money is changing the amount they lend to the person who is issuing the bond or the company who's issuing a bond. So now in this example, Hertz issued an 8% annual coupon bond due 2026 and received $853. What interest rate are the investors receiving under this arrangement? Let's look at what's happening here, okay? So remember, we have an annuity stream, and then we have a future lump sum, okay? So the way we're going to solve this is we can use our financial calculators, and we can say N is the time period. We'll assume we're standing in 2021. So N is 5 because the bond matures in 2026. So 2026 minus 2021 is 5 years. So N is 5. The present value is what Hertz receives today. That's the $853. The payment is the annual coupon payment Hertz is agreeing to make to its lenders. We calculate that amount by taking the 8%, that is the annual coupon in percent, and we multiply it times the face value of $1,000. Remember, the face value is what Hertz is going to pay the lender in 5 years. So when you multiply 8% times $1,000, you get $80. So Hertz is going to pay the lender $80 a year for 5 years. In addition to that, at the end of 5 years, Hertz is also going to pay the lender $1,000. So we'll put that as the future value. If you're using a financial calculator, notice I need to have, I need to have 2 of my numbers be negative. So I put my payment as negative because Hertz is paying that to the investor. And I put my future value as negative because Hertz is paying that $1,000 to the investor as well. And then my present value is positive. Please pay attention to the negative signs if you're using a financial calculator because they will make a difference. You'll get an error code if you don't enter them correctly. And you solve all this and you get an interest rate of 12.09%. So this is what it looks like on a number line. Hertz is issuing a bond, which means they're borrowing money. Today, lenders are willing to lend Hertz $853. So that's the present value. Hertz agrees to make an 8% coupon to the lenders. 8% times the $1,000 face value is $80. So Hertz receives $853 today. That's the present value of this bond. They're going to pay $80 a year for 5 years to the investor. And then they're also going to pay the investor $1,000 at the end of 5 years. Assuming Hertz does all of that on time and pays in full every single time, that is the equivalent of Hertz borrowing money under this bond for 12.09%. And the investor, excluding expenses, is also receiving a return of 12.09% on this arrangement. So that's how they make money. All right, let's look at this one. So AVIS issued an 8% annual coupon bond due in 2026 and received $1,121. What interest rate is the company paying? Okay, so AVIS is issuing a bond. That means AVIS is borrowing money. How much is AVIS borrowing today? Well, lenders are willing to lend AVIS $1,121 today. That's the present value. It's what AVIS is receiving today under this bond. AVIS is agreeing to pay an 8% annual coupon. So we take 8% times the face value of the bond, which is $1,000. And it's always $1,000 in corporate bond world. So you're going to multiply 8% times 1,000. So AVIS is going to pay $80 a year, each year for 5 years to the investors who are lending AVIS the money under this corporate bond. At the end of 5 years, AVIS is also going to pay the investors $1,000. That is the par value or face value of corporate bonds. Okay, so if AVIS wanted to borrow $10,000, they would need to issue 10 of these bonds. And then they would be paying $80 a year under each bond, or $800 a year in total. So to find the interest rate, if we're using our financial calculator, I call it plug and play. Put in what you know for the variables. If it says what interest rate is the company paying, we are solving for I. Okay, so our N is the time period. It's 5 years. The coupon is being paid once a year. So this is an annual coupon payment. So that's why I have 5 times 1. Present value is the amount that AVIS borrowed today. It's what they received today in the present. That's the $1,121. The payment is the coupon payment that AVIS has agreed to pay the investors every year for 5 years. That's the $80. It's only paying it one time a year, so that's why I divide it by 1, which is just $80. The future value is the $1,000 that under corporate bonds, AVIS must agree to repay the lenders that amount at maturity of the bond, which is in 2026 or 5 years from today. Notice I made my payment negative and my future value negative, and then I solve for I, and I get 5.19%. So AVIS is borrowing $1,121 today. AVIS will pay $80 a year for 5 years, plus AVIS will pay the lenders who lent money under this bond $1,000 at maturity of the bond in 2026. Assuming AVIS does all of this on time and in full the way it's supposed to, this is the equivalent of AVIS borrowing money for 5.19%. This is also the equivalent of the lender receiving a return on this bond of 5.19%. So AVIS is paying that interest rate, the lender is receiving this interest rate as a return on the bond. Now, let's put a wrinkle in here. Pretty much the same problem, except it says AVIS issued an 8% coupon bond payable semi-annually, due in 2026, and AVIS received $1,121. What interest rate is the company paying? So notice I still have a 5-year timeline, but now I've divided it to reflect semi-annual, which just means the coupon is payable every 6 months or twice a year, right? Semi-annual, twice a year. So this is how it looks when I'm entering the variables in my financial calculator. N is the 5 years, but now I need to reflect it's 2 payments a year. So N is 5 times 2. The present value is what AVIS receives today. That's the $1,121. The payment is the coupon amount in dollars. So it's the 8% times the $1,000 face value, which is what it is for corporate bonds. That would be $80. Divide the $80 by 2 because the coupon is paid semi-annually or twice a year. The future value is the $1,000 that AVIS under the bond indenture agrees to pay the lenders at the end of maturity in 2026, which I'm assuming is 5 years from now. And then we solve for I. Now recognize that when you get I is going to be the 6-month I, right? I should say the I assuming semi-annual payments. So we need to multiply the I by 2 to get the actual I that the company is paying as an interest rate and what the investor is receiving. That's 5.22%. So at the end of the day, when you look at the cash flows on the number line, AVIS is receiving $1,121. This is the present value. They are receiving it in time 0. They are receiving it in the present. So I have it as a positive number because it's money coming into the company. AVIS is agreeing to pay an 8% coupon, 8% times the $1,000 face value. But since it's semi-annual, we need to divide it by 2. So AVIS is going to pay $40 the first 6 months of every year, and then $40 at the end of the second 6 months every year. And they're going to do that for 5 years. If you count the payments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, notice there are 10 payments. So your N is 10, 5 years times 2 payments a year. At the end of the last period of maturity, so this is now in 2026, AVIS is going to make its last coupon payment of $40 plus pay the lenders $1,000. That is the face value or par value of a corporate bond. So if we present value back all of these cash flows and solve for I, then we know what the interest rate is that AVIS is paying and the investor or the lender is receiving. So that's all for today. Thank you for joining me and learning a little bit about corporate bond world. Until next time, this is your Finance-ista, Cynthia Bush, signing off. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel.